Right, it's 17:05, so time to begin. But before I introduce our speaker for the day, who I'm sure all of you know, I want to say this is probably the most distinguished looking audience we've ever had at the Bangalore Room. I have never seen so many blazers and jackets before. And I even saw a cravat. I mean, that is like, so we've never had that before. So very happy for that. Look at these two fellows, 10th and 11th graders also in their jackets and their little cotton spins. How many Cottonians here? Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. That's lovely to see. Yeah. But before I introduce the speaker, I want to introduce a new addition to the Bangalore Room, this podium. Okay, so people who have been to the Bangalore Room before know that we've never had a podium before. And so Aditya, our speaker for the day, first of all, I have no idea why he agreed when I first asked him. Instantly, he said, yes, I will speak at the Bangalore. I didn't know him at all. So it was a complete cold call, and he said he'd be happy to speak. And doesn't live here, by the way. He lives in Delhi. He's a Supreme Court advocate. But he said yes, senior lawyer at the Supreme Court. And then he said recently that he said, do you have a podium? And I said, first he'd already said that the proceeds are for Bangalore Room, which has already made me happy enough. And then I said, no, we don't have a podium, but we can rig up something for you. We can put two tables on top of each other. And I think that shocked him to the core of his being. And he said, you know what, let me order one for you, and it's my gift to the Bangalore Room. How sweet. What a thoughtful gift. We are going to be using it again and again and again. So thank you so much, Aditya. And he also asked me, do you record your events? And I said, no. Actually, as a policy, we don't, because I feel there is too much digital already in the world. And we are here to build a community of Bangaloreans who will come here. And because the moment you say it's going to be recorded, you know what happens to the attendance. Right, everybody. So we want to build a place where people come, meet other people. And I have to say that in the last 1.5 years, this has been achieved quite happily. And today was the first time, I think, that I was just in a different part of Bangalore, and I ran into someone who I have only known through the Bangalore Room. And it was like, oh, hello. So, new friends being made all over. So for me, it's been a very fulfilling experience.
Like in the Bantam Conference, those of us who came in late, can you just elaborate what all we covered in the past year?
Not now, maybe later, because we need to start with the event. So Dr. Aditya Sondhi is a senior advocate practicing before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Karnataka. He has served as the Additional Advocate General for Karnataka. He graduated from the National Law School of India University, where he has returned to teach constitutional law and other courses. He holds a PhD in political science from the Mysore University, has contributed to the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution. He's been a TEDx speaker, has lectured widely across the country, as also abroad. He's published twice with Penguin India, and his debut play, Famagusta, was shortlisted for the Sultan Padamsee Playwriting Award 2020. So he's been a winner at the Deccan Herald Short Story Competition, that iconic competition. Yeah, wow. I didn't know that. He founded Usher, an amateur theatre circle, and the General K.S. Timaya Memorial Lectures, and this I know, the Ravi Sondhi Spirit of Bangalore Lectures, which are lovely annual lectures, and the podcast, oh lovely, CASTE, the podcast Conversations Around Caste. So big welcome to our very, very distinguished speaker, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rupa, for that warm introduction, and thank you for what you do with the Bangalore Room, more importantly. We're all self-appointed alumni of the Bangalore Room now. Having moved to Delhi, I would see Bangalore Room posts pop up on Instagram and feel complete FOMO. So as a result, I've actually done 2 weekends just to attend a couple of talks here, and it's great to be here as a speaker today. Thank you. I hope the podium and the books didn't influence that decision. I have my task cut out, which is to cover 2 world wars in about 50 minutes or so. So don't mind me pushing along, and hopefully Kojak will wait till the end to ask his questions. There was a story in the Indian Express some months ago which spoke of 2 Bangalore institutions that associate strongly with the World War. One was the MEG, on which we've had a talk by Mr. Vasant earlier, and the other was Cotton Boys. So it's my turn to cover that part of the story. Before I go into the meat of the talk, a few images to appetize you. And by the way, I am a complete PPT novice, so if I mess up, bear with me. The image you see here is O.C. Edwards, a much-loved master at the school and the founder of the Mysore Photographic Society, and the one who took this beautiful image of the school sometime in the 60s. This image, in fact, forms the back cover of my book, which you see here. Few old photographs of Cottons to sort of warm you up. The tar block circa 1917, the office block, the dining hall as it stood with the sort of Dead Poets Society feel. I don't think those plaques and certainly those heads of the bucks are on the walls anymore. The beautiful chapel, which I'll return to a little later. A shot of the tar block, which I incidentally took on Old Boys Day last month. It went viral, and someone sent it back to me saying, "Hey Aditya, have you seen this?" Boxing, which sort of fed into the martial tradition of Cottons. Here we are having a go at the old rival St. Joseph's. A photograph as of 29th July 1939, so almost 76 years to the day. The band, the Cottonian revelers in the 40s, headed by Maurice Lanyon, who trained the sorts of Dr. Raja Ramana and Victor Paranjoti. I don't even know if they're in this photograph. That is the appetizer. Now, before I go into the two wars, I thought I would first quickly refer to a few names of old boys who served in the pre-World War conflicts. And this slide gives you a sort of a glimpse to some of them. Colonel Alfred James O'Hara, who interestingly was the batch of 1870. So remember, school founded in 1865, and someone who passed out in 1870 saw action in the Third Anglo-Burmese War of 1886. Some other stalwarts in there. An interesting individual to talk about is Colonel William Ricketts, who was a surgeon with the Indian Medical Service, awarded a medal with the clasp for his service at Peking in 1900. And though he retired in 1910, he rejoined the service during the World War when he served on the hospital ship HMHS Gurkha. What a nice name. One other, Sergeant William Good Andre, who stood 6'4" in his socks. He was killed in action in France in 1916 and was a lodge master with the Essex Freemasons. And of course, Major Dr. Webster, another officer, batch of 1887, who served with the Medical Corps. I will go into a couple of other names from the pre-1900s. Interesting individuals. Colonel Peter Graham Gow, a member of the British Empire, batch of 1886, who was awarded the MBE at the King's Birthday Honours List in 1919 and later saw action in the World War himself. This gentleman, whose name you see highlighted, Colonel G.H.J. Brown, was later an alumni of St. John's College, Oxford University, a bacteriologist, and saw action in World War I, earned himself a Distinguished Service Order in 1916. This is the plaque, incidentally, from St. John's College, Oxford University. Interesting gentleman, Colonel Thomas Malcolm Russell Leonard, DSO, and if my French is all right, Croix de Guerre of the West African Medical Service. He won the Croix de Guerre as a major with the French government from the French government in 1917 for his services to the Allies in Nigeria, and later won himself a DSO in 1918 for his leadership, was also mentioned in dispatches. And my research tells me that his diaries and photographs in the course of his service in Cameroon, Nigeria, and the West Indies have become a priceless source of information for not just the conflict of that time, but also the sort of curious medical issues that one faced in that period in history. A military cross from the batch of 1894, Major Alexis George Ashburton Dunning of the Indian Army's Officer Reserve. He earned his MC as a second lieutenant in 1917 for exceptional valor. He was mentioned in dispatches. He later raised, you will be interested to find, the 2nd bar 151st Indian Infantry Frontier Force, which later merged with the Sikh Regiment. Captain Robert James McLaughlin, batch of 1898, he was with the Bedfordshire Regiment, killed in action on 1914 at the Battle of N. He was shot while trying to locate an open firing position for his men and was mentioned in dispatches. So French record mentions him for his gallantry under fire and soldierly qualities displayed on every occasion since the beginning of the war. His brother, Colonel Kenelm Rees McLaughlin, batch of 1900, was with the 14th King's George owned Fatehpur Sikhs, later the 11 Royal Scots, and was killed in action a year later on 26/9/1915. He played first-class cricket for the Europeans, and his name figures on the roll of honours at Lord's, also mentioned in dispatches. Moving on to the 1900s, and much of my talk is going to cover some of these old boys who volunteered in the call of duty. Sergeant Edgar Charles Partridge, who was with the Australian Expeditionary Force, he was killed in action in 1915 at Gallipoli. Of him, a friend said, and I quote, "He died as he lived, straight as a rush, fearless to a fault." What a beautiful tribute. Two namesakes from the 1902-1903 times at school, Captain Henry Claude Torrance and Lieutenant Colonel George Leslie Torrance. Now, Colonel Torrance had the unique distinction of having a DSO and a bar, which is not common from the World War I've seen in my research. He earned the first DSO for his splendid leadership and courage and conspicuous gallantry, and later his bar in 2018 for his distinguished service as a temporary lieutenant colonel. Two Christians to follow two Torrance. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Claude Christian, OBE and MC, belonged to the 5th Cavalry. He was the batch of 1916 in school. He earned his military cross as a second lieutenant in 1919. He's recorded to have climbed onto the shoulders of one of his men, fired at the enemy defending the opposite wall, and then dropped into the courtyard to push back the infiltrators. He would later earn himself an MBE in the Second World War. His namesake, Colonel Sir Gerald Charles Lawrence Christian, CSI CIE, was of the batch of 1916 as well. He started off at the Punjab Regiment of the Indian Army and later moved to the Indian political service and had quite a rich career in Gilgit in Khyber Pakhtoon, and was awarded the most exalted star of the most exalted order of the Star of India, and later came to be knighted in June 1946. One character I came across was JSC West, and I haven't been able to quite locate his rank. He was twice mentioned in dispatches for his service at the frontier. And this is the interesting part. While at school, he had to once take charge of class, age 16, when one of the masters had left for England on an emergency. Now you can imagine the pandemonium at that class while Mr. West was in charge. My Hindi master, Dr. Ahmed, is here. Sir, you might recall having left for Hajj in 1989 or 1990. Trust me, there was the same pandemonium then. Confession comes 35 years too late. I want to jump into perhaps the most celebrated name, and in some ways as a Bangalorean too, who is Captain William Leaf Robinson a Victoria Cross batch of 1910. Now, Captain Robinson won the first ever Victoria Cross in the air for shooting down a German Zeppelin, the Schutt Lanz, over London. This is considered one of the most spectacular events in military history still, in a sense. And this was captured in a photograph, which I will come to shortly, titled The Dive to Death, where you see the Zeppelin exploding over the skies of London. This was on 3rd September 1916, when he flew a modified BE-2C. This is the BE-2C that Captain Robinson flew, which suffered damage from the firing that it had to inflict. He was down to his last drum. I mean, speak of the luck of the devil, when he got the Zeppelin over London. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, which, as many of you know, is the highest gallantry award that was on offer during the World War, still is, 2 days later by the King. He belonged to the 39th Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps, and interestingly, some time later was himself taken prisoner of war. He escaped, was recaptured, put in solitary confinement, ill-treated as expected, and ultimately shipped back to Scotland. Unfortunately, he had contracted influenza, which you know was a killer disease at the time, and he succumbed to the influenza in 1918 when he was barely 23 years old. His funeral cortege was driven up Uxbridge Road. He grew up in Uxbridge, which is close to Harrow, with the Royal Air Force Band in attendance. There is a restaurant called the Leif Robinson VC, which is in Uxbridge and still stands to his memory. His biography, The Airship VC, was written by R. Rimmel, and his uniform, his flying uniform, was presented to Cottons by his family. I'm not sure what came of the uniform. This is the image that I mentioned to you earlier, The Dive to Death, an interesting, in fact, a rather glorious piece of artwork which is available. This gentleman, Captain Robinson, for all his exploits, had the following said about him in school, and I quote from the Cottonian of 1916, "Very popular in school and having," I quote, "a peculiar way of getting into and out of scraps without much worry to himself." These were probably settled behind the chapel. Now, Leif Robinson Victoria Cross is, interestingly, the only Victoria Cross from Bangalore, subject to correction by other researchers. This is a list from Military Wiki of schools and the Victoria Crosses that they've produced. It reads a bit like an Olympic table. And you see Bishop Cotton there with one. Above Cottons, you see the RIMC, Dehradun, where General Bhagat, in fact, was the VC awardee. And at the top, you find Eton with 37 and Harrow with 20 Victoria Crosses. But Bangalore has, to its credit, Paramveer Chakra. Captain Gurbachan Singh Salaria, who earned his PVC in Congo, and he went to the Bangalore Military School. So someone to write and talk about as a Bangalore story. Now, behind Leif Robinson's Victoria Cross is a little aside, if I may. And there was a Lieutenant Percy Lovery, who also saw action and was perhaps killed in action. I'll come to that. Now, you know, news trickled in periodically at the time. There were no live updates, obviously. You didn't have Barkha Dutt reporting from the ground. And apparently in one letter to the school, it was indicated that Percy Lovery might have won the Victoria Cross. So there was much buzz on campus saying, wow, we have a second Victoria Cross now. And the warden, in a letter that he wrote, said he was as pleased as the mule in Punch. I don't know if that's where pleased as Punch comes from. I'm not sure. But this tidbit remained as is in the magazines of the times. And there was no follow-up on whether this Victoria Cross was won or not. Now, it's not difficult to discover a Victoria Cross winner because there are lists galore online. But when I was sort of fine-tuning my book, I couldn't possibly leave out a potential Victoria Cross. So, courtesy Facebook, I was able to find Lieutenant Lovery's granddaughter somewhere in the UK, spammed her, and she was nice enough to write back to say, yes, Percy Lovery indeed went to Cottons, but it was not the Victoria Cross, but a victory medal that he won. So it was, in a sense, a storm in a teacup. This is Captain Leif Robinson's brother, his younger brother by 3 years, Second Lieutenant Harold Leif Robinson, who was of the Indian Army Reserve of Officers. He died in action in Mesopotamia on 10/4/1916. He had written to the staff at the school a few months earlier, offering to, in fact, teach if time permitted, pending his commission. He is remembered by Bangaloreans for his role as Portia in the school's production of The Merchant of Venice. I was able to find this reference to Lieutenant Harold Leif Robinson's grave, and he is buried, as we see, at the Basra Memorial in Iraq, and his date of death is mentioned on 10/4/1916. Now, this is actually the incredible part of the record keeping that you find, especially in the UK, I would say, where down to names of families, streets that these individuals lived on, and much, much more, really humanizes, I think, the lives of many of these officers and individuals who went before us. This is a cover of a journal that we brought out in our 150th year with my friends Romel and Karan as co-editors, called Pakka Sahibs No Less, rather modestly. On the cover, you see on the left Lieutenant Harold Leif Robinson as a young schoolboy. At the center is Captain W. Pakenham Walsh, not to be mistaken with Reverend Pakenham Walsh, who was our warden and whose house I went to. Manav did, many others. And to their right is Terence Collins, who later earned himself a CIE and joined the police services. Pakka Sahibs is a treat, I say so myself. It has stories and pieces sent in by old boys from the in fact, not even the 40s, from the 30s all the way to 2015. And a friend of mine, Siddharth Raja from the school across, has also sent in a lovely piece with the Josephite reflection of Cottons. So there is a happy middle ground there. It's not all boxing. Alongside, and I did mention to you the Bangalore Military School. Now, there's an interesting connection there. This is the Bangalore Military School, as you all well know, earlier known as King George's RIMC. I didn't know that was its name for a long while. The first commandant of the Bangalore Military School was an old boy, Lieutenant Colonel R.H.D. Ross, batch of 1910 of the 8th Punjab, who served in the World War and later took charge of the school. He donated the cup for the most scientific boxer among juniors at Cottons and was often spotted at the annual athletics meets. But coming back to Lieutenant Harold Robinson, he had a contemporary, Private Louis Overton, these names are a mouthful, Overton Renus Dunhill, of the 1st Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. And this is how he was described by a contemporary, I quote, "the most irrepressible practical joker the school has ever sheltered." He was at his jocular best, aged 18, when he was the second last man of his section to fall on 22nd 11/1915. A Turkish bullet got him when he had just about managed to reach the barbed wire fence of the enemy's entrenchment. And what warms my heart is that his first salary as a soldier was donated to the school fund. He also lies buried at the same Basra Memorial where his friend and classmate Leif Robinson, Lieutenant, now lies. Along with them was Corporal Reginald Arthur Penrose of the 7th Australian Infantry. He wrote a sonnet, and this is amazing to me, that many of these gentlemen were writing back and forth to school, asking for news, and I'll show you a few letters, asking for school magazines to be sent to them. Obviously, it boosted their morale in some way, and that's tremendous. And he wrote a sonnet to the school from the front in 1913 and spoke of, I quote, "the struggle being not in vain when heaven is the goal of man's way," unquote. That takes me to this interesting slide from one of the old magazines where you see 4 old boys and a master, all of whom were killed in action. To the top left is Second Lieutenant Eric Barton, to whom I will shortly refer. Bottom left is Second Lieutenant Harold Tom White, who was actually captain of school in 1911. He joined the Royal Engineers and died in an air crash over Salisbury in 1917. He captained the school in cricket and football and was quite an all-rounder, I must say, president of the Literary and Debating Society at the school, unlike some subsequent school captains who didn't quite have that prowess. To the top right is Private Hugh, and I was referring to myself, by the way. Private Hugh Gordon Stephens, on the top right, was serendipitously called general by his mates in school. He belonged to the 16th Middlesex Regiment. He was burned badly in an explosion, but insisted on staying on in action, was later shot in the trenches and succumbed in 1916. His brother buried him the next day, and his officers described him as absolutely fearless and an example of coolness under fire. Private Hugh Gordon Stephens. At the bottom right is Lance Corporal Maurice Durlon of the 1912 batch. He was killed in the offensive in Somme in 1916, and Lieutenant Herbert Christian, another Christian, who was a master at the school, also was killed in action. But I did say I would refer to Lieutenant Eric Barton. That's him. A few months before he went missing and was presumed dead, and that look in his eyes I have seen in the eyes of some of my seniors in school, fearless to a fault, up to a bit of mischief, minus the pipe. The pipes were probably replaced by cigarettes in the 90s. Lieutenant Barton was the batch of 1912. He gave up his pursuit of engineering and decided to join the war with many of his school fellows. He passed the Sandhurst exam and was then posted to the 3rd Battalion of the Wiltshire Regiment and involved in the defeat of the Prussian Guards. He was presumed dead in 1916. Now, the interesting thing from this write-up from Find a Grave is that he was the son of Colonel P.A. Barton, V.D., and Edith Barton, who earned herself an OBE. I haven't been able to locate what she got the OBE for, but Colonel Barton himself was an old boy. He in fact served as the chairman of the OCA. He owned, it's not a difficult quiz question, what we know as Barton Center. And he would, as chairman of the OCA, write to himself as the proprietor of Barton and Sons and request for suitable discounts on medals and such other things that would be supplied. So propriety to a rather extreme limit. But once his son, the lieutenant, was presumed dead, obviously killed in action, he sort of packed up shop and left for the UK. And it's thereafter that the Mehtas, as you know, have taken over Barton and Sons, which still stands to this day and is going strong. I have to race along, I'm sorry. This is one of my favorites, Captain Clive Armstrong Johnson, who was captain of school in 1914 of the 6 Jats. He wrote a note to his warden in 1915 thanking him for the Cottonian, that's the magazine, where he said, personally, I quote, "Personally, I have no qualms at all. I know that it's going to be hell, but I'm glad to think I'm doing my share of what every man's conscience tells him to do. He was killed in action on 21/1/1916, aged 18. So as you'll notice, most of them were 18, 19-year-olds. It was customary during the First World War to recruit from schools, public schools. 18 was the age. 16, 17 was sort of the age when, with your parents' consent, you could serve. But apparently many boys, in fact, fudged their age to be able to serve. So fudging is another old Cottonian tradition, I can assure you. And Captain Johnson's, and this is in fact the poster that Rupa sent out, Captain Johnson's sort of exploits were covered by another master from Cottons, who's Lieutenant Cyril Wallace, who happened to be in action at the same time in the same theatre. And he wrote in saying he died taking a bullet to his head, driving his men forward excitedly. And he hoped that his death would be as noble as Captain Johnson's was, and it was indeed the case, because he passed a few weeks later, killed in action on 8/3/1916, a few months later, aged 25. A couple of masters that I must talk about, and this is, an interesting thing, that I think there was the house system, a regimental competitive system in school which fed this martial tradition, if you will. You had seniors who were fighting on the front. You had masters who were themselves distinguished officers. One of them was Colonel Noel Anstruther, who won a DSO and a military cross. He was with the Royal West Kent Regiment. Another was Captain Noel Saunders, an interesting name to remember for the old boys here, because he was the one who wrote the score for the school song. The words were written by Reverend Pakenham Walsh, and he wrote the score for the school song. And when I looked up Captain Saunders at the Imperial War Museum page, I found that his reference number is 48999, which happens to be my mobile phone number. And I'm pretty sure that's not a coincidence. Words in the school song, as many of you know, muster on the side of right, march like warriors to the fight, a sort of a martial call to action, almost. I move quickly to the honored memory of the Cottonians who fell in World War I. I have the small matter of World War II to cover, so permit me to race along. I did tell you that trivia online tells you Bangalore things about people. So Sergeant Ottman, whose name you find here, who died aged 19, fighting to the last, he was from a Coxtown family and was part of the first 11 in hockey. Midshipman Davis was one of 6 brothers and served on the HMS Indefatigable. He was killed in 1916. And one other interesting Bangalore and rather personal connection is of Rifleman Ralph Skip, who I discovered lived on Cunningham Crescent Road, where for the longest time my office has stood. So this is all getting eerily uncanny. There is at the War Memorial, as you know, on Aliasgar Road, a plaque with the roll of honor of Bangaloreans who have fallen in the war. Go and take a look at it if you haven't already. And I lived across it for 10 years, so it was wonderful to see. And you find that many of the names from the previous slide are in fact on this plaque, and you can see somewhere at the bottom right, I should have highlighted, Robinson WLVC, that is William Leaf Robinson, the Victoria Cross. So in all, friends, there were about 175 Cottonians past and present who offered to serve and served during the First World War. This is when the strength of the school itself was about 120. That's unthinkable for you guys sitting here. Your batch is probably 120. So yeah, and barely about 15 to a batch. And Reverend Baisley, who was a boy, a student of the 1917 batch, writes that the war fever gripped the school, and many of the present Cottonians prayed that the war would still be waged when they graduated, so they could do their bit. Reverend Baisley, incidentally, is the one who did a rather memorable service at the chapel later, where I read his sermon, And he used the phrase, green ever green and gold never rust. As you know, the green and gold being the colors of the school. Moving on very quickly to the Second World War. So after this First World War fever, almost, if you will, the school reinforced itself in a way as a bastion for service in conflict. The First 11's field, which was known as the Lambert Field back then, named after a master, Sidney Lambert, had inscriptions placed remembering those who had fallen. There was a brass tablet that was installed on the chapel. This is a photograph of the chapel, fairly unrecognizable now, with a plaque at the top left. I believe that plaque is still there. I seriously hope so. There were 300 Cottonians this time who signed up for the Second World War, including two captains of school, Colonel Terry from the Dogra and Noel Otley, who was at Sandhurst. They say it seemed to have been the done thing. I'm going to now talk about a few legends from the Second World War, but known in school as the following: Simpo, Bobby, Timmy, Freddie, Bunny, and Billy. Simpo is General Sir Frank Ernest Wallace Simpson, GBE, KCB, DSO, batch of 1913, who was from the Royal Engineers. He saw action at Normandy. He was later appointed a Knight Commander, went on to serve a distinguished career with the Imperial Army, with the British Army. He was the Vice Chief, and the Simpson Barracks are named after him. My research tells me that he topped his senior Cambridge exam at Cotton, so unusual choice to have gone into the armed services. This is him at the War Office in London. Bobby is Air Vice Marshal Alfred Charles Henry Sharp, and wow, this is quite a list: CBE, DSO, AFC, SS, LOM, IGSM, and BAR. In fact, these medals I mention because these medals were auctioned as a group of 10 in Australia for 13,000 Australian dollars. He had the distinction of being a British officer who commanded the 8th United States Air Force as its deputy chief. Rather unique in my research. He won the Silver Star Medal, which is the equivalent of a Veer Chakra from the US. As you see, he won several other accolades. He was a Legion of Merit commander. He was born in Bangalore. His father belonged to a civil service family. He later moved to Wimbledon and then Cambridge University. He won the Air Force Cross in 1947 and then the CBE. And interestingly, he chose to retire voluntarily from the Royal Air Force and died when he was just 51. His brother, WCH Sharp, I could not pick up his rank, was commissioned to the Army Service Corps, the ASC, and later moved to Singapore. Around that time was civilian John Watt, a civilian, who served with the cable company in Singapore, and though he had the option to escape, stuck to his post and was killed in action on 15th February 1942. Timmy needs no introduction. General K.S. Thimayya, DSO, Padma Bhushan, 1918 to 22 at school, punched an English senior who tried to rag him for being a native, and was in school with his brothers. You know, General Thimayya's exploits are all too well known, but I found a reference to one of his masters, a Sergeant Burgess, who said to him when he was a schoolboy, and I quote, "Like the princes of the states, you can earn your commission and be an officer. You'll then see the world and be a hero." What a prophetic, call made by Sergeant Burgess. And this brings me back to the point that there were clearly, this was not an act of God. There were clearly masters, wardens, seniors, and people who were there to push the envelope with these students and led them to greater heights. Mr. M.G. Mutanna, Uncle Jagan, who was the batch of 1949, dear friend of Bangalore who passed some years ago, writes in Pakka Sahibs, which I referred to earlier, that during the war, the school uniform, interestingly, was not khakis, because khakis was now reserved for those fighting on the front. So for those years, it was musre grey with black stockings and a solar topi. He writes about another master, a Mr. Reynolds, who was a scout master and won the school many trophies. And I quote, "All of us were fascinated by his hands as he had the hairiest knuckles." And apparently these big hands were used to kill a few enemy soldiers in action. I don't know if that is just a good old Cottonian rumor. But being uncharitable as we are, Uncle Jagan writes, he was also cockeyed, and therefore he was called Mr. Look Here, See There. Now, General Timaya, or Timmy, won his DSO in the Second World War for commanding 8 Kumaon in Burma at Hill 109, which was nicknamed Poland. He would drive up to school as the commander-in-chief, as the chief of army staff was then known, wait at the warden's door, who was then Reverend Isle Thomas, and I've heard from oral history that the warden would then say, "Timmy, come in." Now, these were different times. I mean, today some babu from the BBMP would expect a red carpet to be laid out when they arrive anywhere that they go. So, a certain old world charm. And interestingly, the school stands on what is now known as Field Marshal Karyappa Road. And the General Timaya Road is not far, as you know, from where the school campus is. And that's another interesting part, and maybe a future talk at the Bangalore Room, which is just the names of roads of Cantonment Bangalore, very closely related to its military history, you know, Brigade Road, Infantry Road, Artillery Road, Cavalry Road, South Parade, and then, of course, named after the wars, Asai Road and Miani Road. So Bangalore, the wars, they seem to go sort of hand in hand. But on Timmy, this is a letter that he wrote to the school, as I told you. This fantastic habit of writing back and forth seems to have been par for the course. Dated 10th March 1925, writing to his warden, dear Mr. Haynes. It's an age since I wrote, probably will interest you to hear how we spent our vacation. A party of 8 of us got together, and after spending a week in town, we decided to spend the remainder of our vacation in Switzerland. And then he signs off at the end, I'm sorry the font is not big enough, but I've extracted it, saying, "How is the old school faring now? I don't hear much of it. By the way, I met Dan outside a restaurant in London, and both of us were very surprised. Please remember me to the other members of the staff, to any of the boys that were my classmates. Yours sincerely, K.S. Timaya." Now, this got me thinking as to who Dan may be. Here's Dan. 1922 highlighted H. Dan. This is the hockey team from, well, pretty much from 1919 to much later. These boards, unfortunately, have gone missing, courtesy someone we know. The hall where they stood has also gone missing and has been replaced by something else. But some of us have sort of held on to the hall because the Burma teak that was recovered from it has become chairs, and those chairs are in some of our houses. So if you ever want to come and sit in or on the old school hall, drop by my place. So that's H. Dan. It surprises me that General Timaya was not part of the hockey team. You see another Timaya later, but that's not to be mistaken with the general. Yes, I have to say this about the general's brothers. He had a brother, Major Somaya, known as Freddy. That was the Freddy I promised. He served with the Hyderabad regiment. He was walking his dog while posted in Uri. His dog was about to step onto a landmine. He tried to save his dog, and unfortunately both of them were blown to death. But the third brother of General Timaya, perhaps the most interesting one in a way, is Colonel, and I say Colonel in quotes, Colonel Ponnappa, batch of 1920, who joined Bose's Indian National Army. And he later had the rare privilege of actually being detained by his brother, Brigadier Timaya at the time. And someone asked him if Timmy would take special care of him, and he said all that Timmy would do was give him a hot meal and a cold beer and then throw him in the cooler. That is probably exactly what happened. But this story for me is poignant in a different way because it speaks of two Cottons. You saw this critical mass of officers and gentlemen serving the Allies on, the straight and narrow. But you had Timmy's brother, no less, going offbeat, going into the INA, and there was therefore some room, at least, for such lateral choices to be made. Bunny is Wing Commander Horatio Sales, who was a Victor Ludorum, the winner of the sports prize at school. He won a DSM and represented the RAF in cricket and actually turned out for Ireland in their hockey trials. And lastly, the Billy that I promised is Lieutenant James William Hobday, who was the Pope medalist. The Pope medalist, for some of you, is the nerd, in a sense, of school who tops the school in his boards, was commissioned to HMS Illustrious and was killed in action in 1943. His last words, recorded by the local newspapers of Suffolk, were, "If a man lives conscious of God, he cannot go far wrong." 3 MBEs that I must mention. General A.C. Ayyappa, PVSM MBE, who was the first Indian Colonel Commandant of the Regiment of Signals. This is him as a brigadier seated in the center. Distinguished career both in the World War and later, appointed MBE in 1946 and then a PVSM. He later went on to become the chairman of BEL. So that's a nice Bangalore connection for you. This is the plaque that you find at the BEL Kalakshetra, opened by General Ayyappa as chairman on 17th November 1972. There is also an Ayyappa Park which remembers him. Major Walter Hart won an MBE as a doctor for brave conduct in Assam. His brother, Colonel Mowbray Dick Hart, was also from the Signals, and alongside them was Colonel Apachu, who later served the OCA. And the third MBE that I wanted to mention was Colonel Leslie Hogg, who was later from the MCC, Jairaj, and turned out for the first 11 for cricket and football and earned his MBE in 1945. Now, CLR James, if I can rephrase him with permission, what do they know of the war who only the war know? And I have some characters here who were certainly part of the war, but did other interesting things. Bertram Burt Scott of the 1931 batch, he had a stint at Cottons where he says he was bloody useless at everything apart from sport. That was half my batch, actually. He ran the mile for the British Olympic team at the infamous Berlin Games of 1936, and interestingly came to be appointed the head photographer for the Indian Army during the Second World War. He, in fact, took a photograph, which is the Mountbattens leaving the Viceregal Lodge in New Delhi for the last time. So this is quite an iconic photograph, which I was able to pick up from a blog that one of his later family members writes. Major Priestley and Sergeant Eric Philip Acton, somehow Eric Acton is a name that I remember from the 90s because of his 100 meters record, which he held at 10 seconds, were both Olympians. They ran the Indian Olympic, and Major Priestley ran the Olympic Games. Major Priestley had a twin brother who ran the Bombay Olympics, and Eric Acton was killed in action in 41. And his record of 16 seconds for the 120-yard hurdles and the 100 yards pretty much stood, I think, till our time. And probably it was Mohammad Faisal, if I'm not wrong, who ended up breaking it around 1990. Sidney Friskin, who saw action in the war as part of the Education Corps, but then went on to become one of the best known names as a hockey journalist and writer. This is his book, Going for Gold. He enjoyed covering Pakistan hockey, and he won the prestigious Award of Merit from the Federation of International Hockey. Quite an interesting Bangalore character he is. And Of course, Colonel Murari from the famous Murari family of Timeri Murari and others. He was the first Indian to gain membership of the MCC in London, turned out for the MCC. He was a bat and bowled some leg breaks and played for Glamorgan, contemporary of S. Radhakrishnan while in college. And he was one of the first Indians to get a King's Commission, played cricket till his 70s. And this is a ground that he set up in Hosur, close to Bangalore, a cricket ground. In fact, a livestock farm, which he converted to a cricket field. I have to hear, I of course earlier in a lighter vein spoke of the Victoria Cross that never was, but there is one that almost was. This is Captain K.C. Medappa of the 1934 batch, who maxed his interview at the IMA along with his friend Monty Palit, General Palit. He was the first Indian officer to join the 2nd Sikhs. He was killed in action on 16/12/1941 at Kota Baru in Malaysia while defending a post on the Badang and Sabak beach. Now, there is contemporaneous record to note that his commanding officer, that is A.E. Cummings, actually recommended him for the Victoria Cross. But ultimately, that Victoria Cross ended up being awarded to the commanding officer himself, and somehow Captain Medappa slipped through the ranks, but this is a sign of sheer valor. This is a photograph courtesy Group Captain Chit Karyappa, who's here, of Captain Medappa. His friend and contemporary is Captain Jimmy Machaya. What a great picture. Again, thank you for this, Chit. Of the 2/7 Rajputs, he was killed in action in 1942, an early product of the IMA, buried in Rangoon, and a very highly regarded officer of his time. I have 3 brothers to mention here. And Chit, I must thank you for all of the material that you've given me. This is Colonel C.N. Baba Karyappa, someone we knew well through the Thimaya lectures. His sister Nina was married to General Thimaya. He was the first Indian officer to join the 9th Gurkha Rifles, a solid officer in his own right, and someone who actually disproved a myth of the time that Indian officers were not cut out to command after the Brits had left. His younger brother is Flying Officer C.M. Bunny Karyappa of the batch of 1940. He flew for the number 1 squadron. He flew for the RAF in Burma, where there were other classmates who were involved in action. This is an interesting scroll that Flying Officer Bunny Karyappa has left as part of his collection. And it reads, it's in many languages, but the English bit says, "Dear friend, I am an allied fighter. I did not come here to do you any harm. Who are my friends? I only want to do harm to the Japanese and chase them away from this country as quickly as possible. If you will assist me, my government will sufficiently reward you when the Japanese are driven away." Now, Flying Officer Bunny Karyappa was someone that, the Marshal of the Indian Air Force, Arjun Singh, had marked out for greater things. But Bunny, while crossing a bridge in Japan, and he was all of 21 then, saw blood and bodies in the river beneath him, and he said he had had enough. So he stuck to his conscience, put in his papers, and started to fly as a civilian, and he was ultimately killed in an air crash in Cairo. Interestingly, Mrs. Karyappa, too, was with the Women Armed Corps, and I think there is room for a study of the women of Bangalore who have served. I found one old girl who is Lance Corporal Cynthia Joyner Nee Cooter, who joined the World War at the age of 17. She joined the Auxiliary Corps and then later married an officer from the US Army Air Corps, and their wedding was in fact at St. Mark's Cathedral. Chit's dad, the 3rd brother, C.B. Karyappa, sorry, I don't have an image, who was a Pope medalist in 1931, was himself a civvy, but he sort of joined the war efforts and worked on the internationally acclaimed design of the Curtiss Hawk single-seat fighter at HAL, and in fact served the war as a civilian. He was later chairman of BEL and part of the board of governors as well. I have, if Rupa will permit me, just a little more to cover, which is, yeah, this is a nice one. Now, there are also those who went through school pre-independence and then went on to join the Pakistan Army. They saw action during the World War, but obviously had to make a call and moved across the border. This is a book by Brian Clowley on the history of the Pakistan Army, which he dedicates to the memory of Heskey Beg. Now, Heskey Beg is Brigadier Mirza Masood Ali Heskey. If we hadn't had enough of Freddie and the others, Heskey Beg, who was the batch of 1935. He is a red-lettered name in Pakistan's polo, in fact, and used to be given a 10-goal handicap whenever he took on an opponent. Alongside him, and a great officer by all accounts, to have the book by Brian Clowley to be dedicated to his memory with the words, "Who was all that a soldier should be." Alongside him was Colonel Sikandar Ali Beg, who the school magazine describes as a sticky bat, difficult to dislodge once he gets in. Who am I thinking of now? K.L. Rahul. There was also Colonel Basappa, who was one of the early officers at the IMA. His Bangalore connection is that his old home is what we now know as First Steps, the beautiful Cunningham Crescent home. But coming back to a couple of others who served the Pakistan Armed Services is Brigadier Mustafa Khan, batch of 37, who later actually married Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's sister and served in Pakistan, retired as a brigadier as part of the 3rd Cavalry. His younger brother, Group Captain Sahibzada Siddi Imtiaz Khan, and both of them belonged to the Royal House of Sachin, was captain of school in 1938. Now, this tells me he was the first Indian, if you will, to have assumed that mantle, to be followed by some others in time to come. I have to mention one other name here, which is Colonel Firoz Kotawala. The Kotawalas are a well-known Bangalore family. He was well-known in the equestrian history of the armed services. He trained many future chiefs in equestrian, and his sister, in fact, set up the Sheila Kotawala Institute for the Deaf, which we know is off HL, the old airport road. He was part of the campaign for the accession of Hyderabad. This accession has a different coincidence, because when the accession of Hyderabad happened in 1948, the commander of the Hyderabad state forces was a General S.A. L. Edrus. And General L. Edrus' son happened to have sort of overlapped with some of these gentlemen at Cotton Boys. So the overthrow, if you will, came from within. Brigadier Syed Ali El Edrus was the batch of 1940, served in the First World War as part of the 13 Frontier Force Rifles. I have an image, I believe. There, that's him from the El Edrus family. And later moved to Jordan, where he was a professor and an instructor at the Jordan Army War College, and wrote a very acclaimed book called The Hashemite Arab Army. And as if there weren't enough Cottonians creating trouble in Hyderabad at the time, there was also Colonel Azmatullah, who was part of the Armored Corps, saw action there, and later became the Chief Security Officer of the Nizam of Hyderabad. On the Pakistan bit, and I'll only take half a minute, this is a book by Brigadier Z.A. Khan, Zahir Alam Khan, called The Way It Was, which is a tremendous, and I've researched and used this for my book Poles Apart, where he calls the bluff about the whole 1971 war and how much of it was an inside job. He was at school as the batch of 1945 with two other brothers, one of whom was squadron leader Shoaib Alam Khan, who won a Sitare Jurrat, which is the equivalent of a Veer Chakra. They were, I think, in all 8 or 9 brothers. 3 of them were at Cottons, a couple of them were at Baldwin's. So the Baldwinians here pick that up, Bhavna, pick this up. They went pretty far in the Pakistan Army. And this is a very readable book for those of you who want to know about the inside working of the Pakistan Army. I am nearing the end. This is the plaque that remembers Cottonians who fell in the Second World War, which I think is a nice place for me to wrap up this rather long presentation. Many familiar and some unfamiliar names, one of whom is Lieutenant Neville Puckridge of the Royal Artillery. Known as Puck, he was hit by Japanese shelling and died in 1945. His commanding officer described him as an officer who was tremendously respected and loved by his men, whose cheerfulness was an example to all ranks. I did have a slide, and I won't take much time on it, but these are the old boys who were mentioned in dispatches in the Second World War. Many of these names you would have in fact seen in those hockey name boards that I had pulled up earlier. But coming back to the old boys killed in action in the Second World War was also Lieutenant Edward Nelson House of the Royal Deccan Horse. He left the school in his 8th standard, so he must have been, 14, 13, and joined the OTC, was a gifted pianist. Flying Officer Cecil Owen St. Vincent Norris was head of day scholars in 1942, a Foley Prize winner in Latin. And here's the nice part. He moved to Cottons from the Cantonment Orphanage. Now, the Cantonment Orphanage was set up by Reverend Samuel Taylor Pettigrew, who incidentally founded our school. He could have well named it the Pettigrew High School, but he was clearly a self-effacing man and dedicated it to the memory of Bishop George Edward Lynch Cotton, whose life and work inspired Reverend Pettigrew. He's a proper Bangalore name. You recognize this? The All Saints Church, founded again under the auspices of Reverend Pettigrew. And some of you must have seen the Pettigrew Street right off St. John's Church, again named after Reverend Pettigrew, who was our founder. And if you can give me half a second more to make sure I have not missed any of these very long drawn slides, Rupa. Yes, there's one Bangalore connection that I wanted to make as I close, which is of Lieutenant Jack Stanford, who was captain of school in 1934. And again, writing to the school, asking for copies of the school magazine to be sent to him. And this actually is the point I tried to make. He confessed that these magazines raised the spirits of his and fellow Cottonian prisoners of war. His brother Leslie, who was a civvy, had won the Silver Cross, which is the second highest award for gallantry as a scout, as a patrol leader in 1933 for his efforts to save the life of a drowning boy at what the magazine says is the Malleshwaram tank. I suspect it's Sankey tank, where this action played out. Well, in memory of the old boys that fell in World War I and II, there are 2 plaques that now stand on campus, donated by an anonymous old boy who happens to be me. Not great photographs, I'm sorry, but this is from the First World War in the garden block opposite the tar block, and these from the Second World War with a school bag thrown in for good measure. That is the Cotton story. I think that tradition paid itself forward. The Air Marshal Mally Wallens and the Admiral Shekhawats and the General Jimmy Mahmoods, I think, would have picked up from this pulse. And since we are doing this around Kargil Vijay Divas, Colonel Lalit Rai, whose classmates and friends I see here, Colonel Sohn, CN, many others, who earned himself a Veer Chakra during the Kargil operations. But ultimately, friends, this is a big slice of my life, obviously, because I went to the school, and having researched 2 books on the school, I found in some ways this history most interesting and fascinating and even moving in parts. But I believe it's an important slice of Bangalore's history as well, and I believe the city is the better for it. Thank you.